Okay, we're going to talk about how I wired this car, a little bit at least. So I've got my Optima battery here. Obviously you don't have to put yours there, but we've got a tray built in. The tray keeps it, boy, that's where it focuses, is way over here. Stupid. Anyway, so the tray, we'll just keep it secure down there once we put the tabs in. And don't mind, like I'm not the cleanest wiring guy in the world. I don't care about like each wire fitting perfectly and flowing perfectly, so don't mind that. Plus we're not completely done yet here, but anyway, so I put a ground pole, just welded it to the chassis right there, ground the paint off the chassis, welded that on there, and then I can run several grounds to it, but I'll have my main battery ground going to it. And then the Holly, which we've got mounted right over here, runs separate power and ground directly to the battery. So those posts there will host those things. Then we've got basically the only cable that would be hot if I have my ignition or my main switch off. The only cable that would still be hot would be the 2-foot cable going to that switch from the battery. So once that switch is off, everything is shut off on the car except for like that 2-foot chunk of 2-gauge wire that I've got. From there, I run that to the distribution block here, and from there we go out to a bunch of different circuits. Like 5 or 6 of those are different ABS wires, which require 12 volts or ground. So you can see some of those. Let's see what else. 2 of those trigger, sorry, no they don't trigger. 2 of them are power that go to these relays up here. So these are a couple fan relays and my fuel pump relay. So the fan relays are heavy duty. They're 60 amp fuses and 60 amp relays, I believe. And that's because those fans draw a ton. So I've got 2 fans up there and they draw a lot. They don't draw 60 amps continuously when they're running, but they draw a lot when they're first kicking in, because I don't have them pulse width modulated. It's just on or off. So and then we trigger those with the ground from the Holly ground. Holly suggests using the ground trigger. So we trigger the ground side of the relays with the Holly system. So I just connected those to the 2 wires they recommend in the instructions. So that'll be easy to control those and tell them when we want them to turn on. For now I'm thinking I'll probably turn one on at 180 and the other one on maybe at 190 or 195 or something. What else? The switch pros, so we've got one of the wires down here off of the distribution block is the trigger wire for the switch pros to turn that on. So when I turn on the main power here, it will turn on the switch pro, and then from there you can see I've got my ignition and start button. Let me zoom in so you can see. I've got my ignition and start button. I've got my brake lights, or one of the brake lights, so it's a 2-stage whatever bulb in there. So one of them will be running lights for the rear, so that when I'm driving at night we'll have obviously the lights on, and I'll have a second one for the silly light bar that will be running for night races. And then I still have a brake switch too. So my brake switch in this one is actually I'm using a physical brake switch, a momentary switch on the pedal itself, to for the information for the ABS system. And then under here I've got my little pressure switch. I doubt you can barely even see it, but it's back behind there somewhere. So I've just got 12 volts going to it and then out of it to the brake lights in the back. And let's see, that's, I don't know, that's about it. I will have a cool shirt tank sitting right here, and we'll wire that into the switch pros, so I'll just be able to hit a button and have the cool shirt flowing nice cool water through my shirt. What else? The Holly stuff's all basically plug and play except for a few things. So alternator, fuel pump, and fans. And the Holley still controls the fans and the fuel pump, but you just run them through relays, as it wouldn't put out enough amps to, it would get too hot and you'd melt wires or pop fuses or whatever. So ABS, I'm not going to get into that. That's its own standalone deal. We can do a whole thing on that if we want to later. I did recently I did a little bit more detailed about how that works. And then alternator. So alternator is pretty simple. You just run your power wire, in my case, from the back of the mains switch power, which that switch is good for 350 amps, so it's more than enough for the whole car, especially on something like this with very little. I mean, there's only the most basic of things on this car. So we run a 2-gauge wire from there down to the starter, and then another 12 small, like it's probably a 12-gauge wire from the starter solenoid to my switch pros, which is in the car, and the switch pros. So then I'll just turn that switch into a momentary switch once it's time to program, so that when I hit the start button, it'll hit the starter, and when I let off, it'll stop. So it won't just be on off, it'll be a momentary where it's only on when you're pushing it. From there, another 2-gauge wire runs up to the alternator. I have a lot of clearance with this short, shallow oil pan, so I just went underneath, used some clamps to keep it clear of things, and then up to here, some heat sleeve up here to the alternator. There you go. In my case, you wouldn't normally do it like this. There's one wire that you need to connect. It's this third from the left. Well, just look at it. It's easier to look at it than me explain it. That wire, brown one in this case, needs 12 volts on switched power. So being this will only see power when the thing is switched, I just ran it from there to there. It saved running it inside the car. So that's really the extent of the wiring. Like I said, the Holley stuff is very, very complete. It's all plug and play for your application. So that harness makes things a lot easier. I put heat shielding on that wire. That's my 2 separate powers to the fan. So fans are obviously there. 2 wires there, and then I just ran a ground underneath to the bottom of the chassis here, cleaned that off and bolted that in. So and then fuel pump, I ran a 10-gauge wire up here along with 2 wires that go to power the lights, the tail lights. Come through my little firewall here. One runs back to the fuel pump, and the other 2, the little guys, go back to power the tail lights. So we'll have 2-stage tail lights. One will be for driving at night, and the other will be when I hit the brakes, they'll get brighter. So yeah, that's the wiring stuff.